I had no idea how many individuals around the world suffer from motion sickness and how many individuals cannot sit in a car and read a newspaper, read a book, or even respond to a text message. I had no idea how vast that is. Why is that? What causes that?
Yeah, and that's a great question and a very common misconception. The reality is, a lot of research has gone into it, and they have found out that 1 in 3 people are considered to be highly susceptible to motion sickness, right? So it's 33% of the general population that's affected by this problem. Now, a lot of times people don't realize how widespread it is because they're often the drivers, right? So the drivers very rarely get motion sick, but when they're passengers, they might experience that more. Another reason why people might not notice it is because they don't realize the full spectrum of symptoms that are associated with motion sickness, right? So we know nausea is one of them, but the reality is that fatigue, drowsiness, feeling temperature changes, mood swings, headaches, all of those symptoms can be associated with motion sickness, but people don't necessarily associate it with. So sometimes they don't realize that, hey, they are affected by motion sickness. Or in other cases, they make certain behavioral changes they have internalized so much that they don't even notice that the problem impacts them. So, for example, we ask people, do you struggle with motion sickness? And some people will say, no, I just don't use my phone inside of the car. Well, then you do struggle with motion sickness. You're just making certain corrections to avoid it. What if I could tell you that there might be a way for you to be able to be productive in your car, right? So that's why sometimes the problem is not as perceived as big as it actually is.
Did you in your research that you've conducted, does the aha I have motion, does that happen when an individual goes from primarily being a driver to riding in the vehicle, and then you have one of these like oh moments? Is that when they kind of start to first notice it, or is it something earlier on?
Yeah, so sometimes people have experiences early in life that kind of tells them that they have motion sickness and they understand it. But ultimately, it comes down to a lot of genetic predisposition, right? Some people are inherently going to have more susceptibility than others, and some drivers might never struggle with motion sickness. But oftentimes, that shows up first in childhood. Normally, younger people are more susceptible to motion sickness. Some people kind of grow out of it and they lose that sensitivity, but for other people, it just stays throughout their life and it impacts them directly. A lot of people report, struggling with this, some people to very intense cases. But it's just that moment of like when you sit in the passenger seat or public transportation and you're first starting to see, oh, I can't be on my phone. I just don't feel something's not right, or my stomach's starting to feel upset, or I'm starting to feeling excessively warm. That's really when they start picking up on it.
Is the main way that individuals cope without your product is looking forward? Because I've read some reports where if an individual looks out the right side of the window or the left side of or they can't see out, it's like, oh, it starts to, I'll use the term, I'm not a doctor, to accelerate the symptoms. Is that one of the main ways they cope, is by looking forward as the vehicle moves?
Yeah, so and that goes to what causes motion sickness, right? So your body is at all times trying to estimate the motion that you're experiencing. So your eyes and your inner ear and your sense of touch all work together to tell your brain how your body is moving in space. And at the same time, your brain is trying to predict what's going to happen next. So if any of those systems have conflicting information, your brain starts to send these mismatched signals that show up in the form of motion sickness symptoms, like we talked about. So if you're not looking at the road, for example, your inner ear might be detecting a lot of motion, but your eyes cannot detect that same motion. And that conflict can cause motion sickness. That's why looking at a phone often increases the incidence of motion sickness. But there are other things that you can do to kind of improve how your brain is expecting certain kinds of motions and reconcile all those sensory systems so that you have a better picture of what is actually going on.